Thank you for joining us today. I'm sure we'll have a few more joining us after Sharon gets started, but in the interest of time, I know she has a lot of great information to go over with everyone, and so I want to give her a chance to really maximize her time with you today. If you have not already, just a fair warning, I am recording this webinar today, so I have muted, I think, all of your computers and phones to this point. Just keep in mind that any background noise or whatnot, should you unmute that on your end, would be included in the recording and open to anybody who requests a copy. So please, if you haven't already, or if I cannot mute your phone or your computer, whatever you're listening in from, to the application, so that way that background noise doesn't disrupt Sharon or get recorded for others. If you have a question for Sharon throughout the presentation or are having some other issue, please utilize the chat box that's available to you through the application. You can send it directly to me or to everyone, and that will allow the question or the whatnot to be addressed as quickly as possible. I also ask that if you have an iPhone or a phone, a cell phone, iPad, tablet type thing that you're also working through during the presentation, that you keep that as far away from the phone or the computer that you are participating in the webinar through. We have had some issues in the past with that causing some feedback that interrupts the presentation. So real quickly before Sharon gets started, just a little bit of, I guess, background as to how we got here today. As many of you know, because several of you did utilize the services through the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence with both Sharon and Ann, who helped us do our campus climate surveys in the spring of 2018. Most of you did them during that time period. And there was some leftover money in that original contract. And so as services began winding down, Ann and Sharon and I began discussing what other things could be done with some of the money and services to help our campuses. And Sharon, of the many things that she suggested, which were all highly intriguing and interesting and of value, was that she had this large set of data for both employees, but also for survivors on our campuses, reflecting their experiences, but, you know, with the programs and the offerings and things that were campuses reviewed in their climate surveys. And so that was one of the ideas that I just thought not only was very intriguing, but that had an ability to help reframe both the work we're doing through the Changing Campus Culture initiative, but also locally on campus, to really hear that voice of the survivor and their experiences with all of our programmatic pieces, our trainings, our education, and our overall efforts to end sexual violence or gender-based violence on our campuses here in Ohio. So that was one of the items that we picked out for Sharon to compile that data report and put it into a webinar that she is going to share with you today. So I'm very excited to have her share with you those results. There's a ton of information. So if you have questions come up, please feel free to put those in the chat room to me, but realize that she may answer them in 2-3 slides later, but we'll work through that in the end. But don't hesitate to pose any questions that you have throughout the presentation. And without further ado, I will turn it over to Sharon.
Great, thank you, Carrie. And if you want to leave the first slide, I just wanted to acknowledge I really see this as an opportunity to dig into the data as Carrie just described. And before I go on, I want to acknowledge other collaborators in this work. So first and foremost, the state leadership on this issue here in Ohio, from the governor's office on down to our tireless coordinator, visionary, champion, and Carrie Solar at the ODHE, has been tremendous. I haven't seen this type of scope and put your money where your mouth is resources in any other state in the country. Please let me know if you've seen anyone that's done it. I do know some are following suit, so that's great. It was my absolute pleasure to work with my good friends at the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. They've been a key partner with ODHE in the Changing Campus Culture from the outset, and remain a source to all of us doing this work across the state. So I urge you to look up my partner, Ann Brandon, the statewide director of prevention, and her team. They offer a wide range of training and technical assistance opportunities. One additional data plug on that is the research that I've looked at does show you see the biggest adoption of prevention practices, not in campuses that receive money for it, not in campuses, I mean, that helps, but the biggest in a study that kind of controlled all this, the utilization of training and technical assistance was the strongest correlate to adoption of innovative prevention practices. So they're there to help. Last but not least, I want to thank all of you who represent campuses. Again, this project has required people to step out of their comfort zone, make mistakes, get up, try again, learn, look at into some of the dark corners, and figure out how to use that information to move forward. And it was an honor and a privilege to work with all of you, people who helped to collect this data, put in hours of phone calls with Ann and I, and revising surveys, and recruiting folks on campuses. And of course, we know the students and employees that shared their experiences with us are the reason that we're having this conversation today. The data are organized according to the 5 recommendations that you're looking at now. So we all know, hopefully, a little bit about the context of this Changing Campus Culture initiative. If you don't reach out to, if you're on this call and you don't reach out to one of us, we'll get you connected. It's, again, in terms of scope and vision, really quite a project. If you want to advance, Carrie, to the next slide. I'll talk a little bit about the climate surveys, but not too much, and the following one after that. So this is the first recommendation, is use, yeah, this is good, right here. So OAESB, the climate survey team, which included myself and Ann, worked to collect this data. There were a number of people that used consulting services to design their own surveys. 50 campuses kind of stuck with us through the whole process of submitting all their data to us. So those are the data that I have available to analyze. I just want to acknowledge there's many people, many campuses who collected their own data. So we don't have, every campus in the state. What we do have is employee data from 32 campuses, which has not previously been aggregated or looked at, so that's going to be new. And then, as Carrie talked about, the additional analyses conducted with the survivors, any student who reported one or more of the experiences that we asked about. So you can advance to the next slide, and what you'll see here is just the numbers behind it and the colors that I'm going to use in displaying these data to you. So the first comparison I want to look at is the differences between students and employees. And overall, if you look at the slide that's appearing there now, generally speaking, the experiences, the responses we received from employees suggest that they experience safer campuses, less sexual misconduct, they report at higher rates than students, and receive more training. So, this is a general snapshot. We can say that the change is starting from those staff and employees that kind of hold down the fort on campuses. Students are a little more slippery, right? They come in cohorts, they're in and out over years. Many of our campuses have online populations, non-residential campuses. So students are a little bit harder. And I would just take this point to say, if you didn't collect employee data, or you haven't really thought about working with your employees, again, they do make up the bones of our campuses. And I often suggest people, especially with those difficult to reach, difficult to engage student populations, to start with your employees. You can advance to the next slide, Carrie. So these are prevalence rates. Not every campus opted to collect data of their employees at all, and many campuses opted to not ask the prevalence questions of experiences of sexual misconduct. Of those that did, these still represent percentages. So these are not number counts, these are percentages. Again, we see employees reporting sexual victimization experiences at lower rates than students. You can advance to the next slide, please. So one more. I'm going to start by looking at knowledge and attitudes. And I'm kind of using this process of giving you the finding, kind of showing you the data viz, and then ending up with an implication. And it's in the implication, and I'll provide, if we have some time at the end, some recommendations as well. The implication is generally an opportunity for you to make a decision. The recommendation is me saying, here's the decision point that I gave you as an implication, and here's the way I might nudge you. But of course, you all are the experts on your campuses. What we did see is that employees received more training than students, and everybody who received training, whether employee or students, reported significantly higher knowledge scores. So it was effective, and you can advance to the next slide, Carrie. This shows the difference in who received training. 49% of students, 83% of employees. You can advance to the next slide, and you'll see what we're comparing then. So we can break those in those colored bars that we just looked at. We can kind of divide and look inside that bar to say, what are the differences between trained and untrained individuals in both among the students in purple and the employees in teal. If you advance to the next slide, the pattern is pretty similar. Overall, employees report higher mean knowledge on these key indicators that were benchmarked, so more than students. And again, what you're looking at right now is training is controlled. These solid dots are the employees that received training and the students that received training. If we look at the next slide, we'll see that both groups who were trained did better than their counterparts. And overall, the fact that those green dots, teal dots are a little bit to the right means even among untrained employees, they tend to report greater knowledge. This is not new information in some ways. We've added in the green dots. When I did the other webinar, we looked at this difference, and we talked about this with many campuses on their calls, but it's really exciting because I think training is a heavy, heavy load. It's a lot of labor, it's a lot of expense. You guys know that how many dollars go there, it's minutes, so to see that it pays off, I think is really important to just revisit this one more time. And then we'll advance. The implication here, again, is that prevention training should be expanded until everyone receives training. A lot of times if we thought that there wasn't any changes in knowledge, then we say, okay, it is such a heavy lift. It's all those hours, all those dollars. Should you put that elsewhere? Our data suggests no, keep on keeping on. The training is a good thing. And we can look at our next finding. In terms of evidence-based training, one of the big things we have available to us are bystander education, a series of programs. You all probably know them better than I do, that work to engage entire communities in recognizing their own role, our own role in stepping up to address harassment, violence, all the risk factors that lead to it when we see it. We see this as an emerging trend. We're not at 50% yet, but we're getting there. So let's take a look at the data. Very, very, very similar, identical rates of actually taking action when you witness sexual misconduct. So the first question, which is shown in that bar entitled witnessed, it was since coming to your campus, have you witnessed or observed something you believe was or could have led to sexual misconduct? So it's a mouthful. Hopefully people read that carefully and they could say yes or no. And there was I mashed all those results together. If they saw something or they suspected they saw something, I'm calling that witnessed. So small percentage of survey respondents, but 18% is a key one for us. If we look at Rogers' adoption of innovations, 18% is what we call crossing the chasm from innovators to the early majority. So for those of us who are into kind of nerd science on prevention, that 18% is an exciting point to get to. So again, of those small percentages, the purple and the green bar that you're looking at that say 13 and 18%, only those folks using branching logic on the survey were then asked, okay, did you intervene? In both cases, almost 4 out of 10 said yes. If we look at the next slide, we can look at what students and employees are doing, and I highlighted some of the bigger differences. So students were more than twice as likely to step in and separate people involved in the situation. Again, the context of what they're witnessing is probably different. There's a lot of training in programs like Step Up or Green Dot or Bringing in the Bystander that specifically train folks on that. So that's pretty exciting to see. Also twice as likely to ask others to step in as a group, which is one of my favorite exercises in collective efficacy. So happy to see, again, it's a small rate, but you see your student, again, this is the difference between student culture and employee culture. Employees were more than twice as likely to tell someone in a position of authority. So they see something and they know they're a responsible employee. They're going up the food chain just the way that you've trained them, or recommending the person to counseling resources. So again, in an indirect way, I think this is evidence that the training that you're doing is working because these patterns didn't have to emerge. You don't, if we shuffled this randomly, the fact that we're seeing more than twice as many people in these groups doing things compared to the other group, again, shows that the targeted messaging, the kinds of things you're educating your different groups on campus about employees versus students is working. So I take this as a big yay. You can advance to the next slide. The implication here is, people will do it. If you build it, they will come. So I think that the upstander behavior, some of the positive social norms that we're going to look at later in this talk, should be really marshaled and leveraged and channeled as driving forces in your work. If you haven't already, I know we're preaching to the choir. This is one of the things we say all the time: collaborate, 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 engage your students, student leadership. One more opportunity point challenge for you to take us up on that, because the data are suggesting that both students and employees are responding, they're learning, and they are taking action when they see these kinds of situations. The next thing we're going to talk about is community readiness. The finding here, and again, this was a smaller set of campuses within the smaller set of campuses that interviewed their employees. Not everybody asked, but a pretty healthy subset of campuses asked readiness questions. And we have a pretty striking finding that the current readiness across the state is at a 7 of 9. So if we look at this next slide, it's going to be hard for people that aren't familiar with this data to see this, but you generally look where the tallest bar is, and that's an indication of the level of readiness. So this, if you count across that 7 stages out of 9, I think it was 6 in-depth readiness assessments not too long ago. I want to say it was like 2014, and the readiness was down in the 3 and 4, so where it says awareness and pre-planning, and those were some of the very same campuses that are participating in this climate study now. So we've made huge leaps. And this is what we call an outer layer construct. This is a risk, or this is a protective factor at the community and societal level. So this is not just moving individuals' knowledge. This is a big picture move. And so this is, again, a really big yay and exciting finding for me. Within these teal bars, I did slice a little farther and found that trained employees and staff versus your faculty, adjunct and tenure track faculty reported higher levels of readiness for prevention. And again, that's not too surprising. Those are often your frontline workers, your responsible parties, your educators, your Title IX coordinators, your deputies, your investigators. They're there, they're ready, let's go. Next slide. This is what I kind of just said. There was a little note at the bottom of that previous slide. I did do some comparisons. So even within that teal bar, there are patterns of where you're shifting readiness, where we're seeing folks that are most willing to say, yes, this is my job. Write it into my job description, write it into my moral code. This is the kind of thing I do. No differences in gender at all. I looked at that difference. There was no difference by gender. So we have, this is a no matter your gender kind of thing. People are ready to address this issue among your employees. There are one of the reasons I think that this is exciting is because there's a lot of theory and there's a lot of applications. There's a lot of work out there on what you should do if you know where your campus's readiness is. There's a link here. If you advance to the next slide, I've also prepared kind of a summary version of this. You can reach out to Ann Brandon and her team at the Ohio Alliance to get a copy of this and talk through it. Again, I kind of, back in the day, I think this was 2015, kind of thought about campuses as three big chunks of low readiness in purple, middle readiness in teal, and then high readiness in orange. And where you see that rectangle is kind of where everybody was, which again is exciting because a lot of people were in purple not too long ago. If you advance to the next slide, I'll show you just a little bit. So the columns of this document kind of talk about the things that we recommend. Overall, you want to be building a team and working in coalition on this issue. Reach out to your local law enforcement, reach out to your local centers, reach out to peer educators, to other people with prevention. So not that it's an option. Everybody at every level of readiness should be working in partnership, but what the goals of your partnership are varies. That's that first column, the kinds of training topics that you would be doing with your key partners. Again, these are staff, probably more so than students. Bystander empowerment and engaging men. This is messaging specifically targeted towards students, and then how to continue to use data to action. So that last column is kind of like the ODHE's recommendation one. And this resource was developed after Campus Save came out, but before Ohio rolled out the campus, Changing Campus Culture initiative, but I think there's still relevant info there. So available to you through Ann or online, you can find it as well. Next slide. Generally, again, the goal here is how do you stabilize these programs, especially when you have changes in leadership. We have a change in the governor. You probably have changes in your staff. How do you really stabilize these programs? How do you diversify financial support and get hardline money budgeted in? How do you get program evaluation? Those kinds of practices we do know sort of pin down prevention work. Again, if this is an opportunity, I have recommendations, but the implication here is that if you are at a 7, your goal is to stabilize sexual misconduct prevention programs. How you get there is, again, everyone's going to have a little bit of a unique path. I think we may be switching on. Yeah, so we're moving on to recommendation 3, which is communication campaigns. So this is our all kinds of ways of messaging, what our campus lack of tolerance for sexual misconduct, that one case is too many, we're not going to tolerate this. Hopefully, if you're looking at this, you'll remember all these because it's too much to get into. The trend I want to point out is that on the majority of these communication strategies are more recognized by employees, so they're more salient. The dosage, they're sinking in to employees more so than students. That's not entirely the case. So Intro to Title IX and Sexual Misconduct at New Student Orientation was compared, again, this is comparing only to campuses who also had an Intro to Title IX at their new employee orientations. And if you look at those comparisons, students are much more likely to remember that, and who knows why. It's on Us campaigns, again, that's a universal marketing campaign that both employees and students would be exposed to in theory at similar rates, and students are picking up on that a little more. Other than that, students and employees are hearing your messages either similarly, or employees are hearing them more, where you see the higher bars and the highlighted words in that list of activities. We can take a look at, again, if we sort of split on the next page, on the next slide, generally, your trained employees, your staff as opposed to faculty, and your female employees compared to other genders, were recognizing some of these communication strategies more so than others. So the trained versus trained, if you look at that little, again, this is all going to be available in a document, a report, but if you look at that first little graph, all A through K, training has an effect on every single communication strategy. There are fewer differences by role on campus, staff, and by gender. There are some, but again, I think this is another bit of evidence supporting the more training that you're doing. We know that it takes 7 times of hearing something to sink in. So if you've trained people, they're more primed to see and recognize and register. I mean, every day we walk through our campuses, and I know we have to tune out a lot. People who are trained are more likely to tune into those additional messaging campaigns that you have that reinforce this cultural norm that we will not tolerate sexual misconduct on our campus. So continue to train your employees. Next. Okay, so now I'm looking a little bit into the survivor experience, and this kind of, I furrowed an eyebrow at this at first. So survivors were generally less aware than non-victims about resources on campus. I'm not exactly sure how to explain that. All of the ones that you see there were statistical differences. One thought I have, and I challenge you all to think about this as well, is it's easy to kind of say, did you see the online training? Did you see our awareness campaign? And if you're kind of like, I'm pretty sure I did. Whereas maybe if you're a survivor, you're more likely to say, no, I sure wish that I would have. Maybe think about it. I'm not exactly sure why this is, but it's somewhat problematic. I mean, this is work that we have to do. The people that need to hear those messages the most, that need to know you have a policy, that need to know you have a Title IX office, that need to be have their experiences validated through awareness events, et cetera, they are reporting that they're less aware that those events are happening. And again, the only campus that would have included this question on their survey is someone who's doing it. So we can't say, these represent percentages of only campuses who were doing each of these things included the question. So it's it's a point, it's a place for us to improve. Next slide. So, well, actually, wait, if you go back to if we take a look at yeah, stop right there. Okay, so in addition to, so we asked first about, did you hear the messages? Did you hear about the things that we were doing, the activities? And then we asked a series of questions about how did that affect your internal sense of climate? And the reason that this is problematic, again, is that survivors had consistently and statistically significantly lower scores on almost all our indicators of a positive climate. So they're hearing the messages that you're throwing out less, and that corresponds with a lower sense of safety, a lower sense of belongingness and connectedness. Again, this is compared to students who did not experience sexual misconduct. They agree less that all people contribute to a positive, supportive climate. You know, again, we broke that down into students versus administrators versus staff. They perceive a more hostile climate for minority groups. Generally, they're just walking around with less wellness and personal kind of resources and than our non-survivors. So again, why is this important? Well, because it matters. We know that these things can reduce their ability to succeed academically and in the workforce as well. Okay, right, I'm ready to advance. All right, so what more can we do? Well, recommendation 4 is developing that comprehensive protocol. I think that I said at the beginning, the implication that training not only had an effect on knowledge, it had an effect on attitudes, and how we sometimes call this institutional faith or confidence that your campus is going to be there for you if something like this were to happen. Again, this is in some ways a hypothetical question. We know that some of the people representing those purple and teal dots are survivors because we saw that they answered yes to those questions, but I didn't compare survivors versus non-survivors. What you're looking at here is the differences between trained and untrained students. And again, the message I want you to hear is that the training that you're doing goes beyond that sort of initial uptick in knowledge to also affect institutional faith, confidence in your campus's ability to respond to sexual misconduct. And generally speaking, again, employees are feeling a little more confident, not across the board and not on every single indicator, but more or less the pattern is there. Less of a huge difference here. You know, we don't see that big gap we saw on the first dot plot, but still important success that you all are having in the work that you do. Next slide. I want to talk a little bit about if you have a good protocol in place, in addition to increasing that institutional faith, it should also shift norms. So if that protocol is there and people are consistently and appropriately using the protocol, over time, the social norm should start to exist on campus that, you know, here on our campus, we report these things when we see them. We support students who make the reports. We report harassment when we see it. And so overall, it's working. Nationally, we've got a big movement towards this, but here in Ohio, this first line graph that you're looking at is all students, so all 19,000 students. When you asked them, would other students on your campus, again, this is all perceived norms, so not would you do this, but would other students on your campus support someone who made a report? Would they report someone who used force to get sex? Would they report harassment if they saw it? Would they be interviewed in a sexual misconduct case if they knew something? Would they confront harassment when they saw it? And those were these were percentages of all students who said it was moderately or very likely that other students would do that. So it is a positive norm, which is good, because if this norm didn't exist, then we'd want to work to change it. But it's pretty good. There are, if you look at just the dots, the next page is going to slice and dice that a little bit. So we see it's much more normative among employees. So again, employees are those bars, that's 80, for report force, that's 81% of employees that said their peers, other staff and employees of the campus would report force, sex-based force if they saw it. Really close to that normative line of 50% is the survivors in our sample. So again, I didn't break the employees down. I looked at it, there weren't significant differences, but there was statistically significant differences, again, between survivors and students who did not experience violence, with, perhaps not surprisingly, non-victimized students saying it's much more normative to do these positive things, and survivors saying, wasn't my experience. So especially concerning is that confronting of harassment, that 49%, it was not perceived as normative from the perspective of survivors. Kind of hard to address that with just that group, because social norms change is a primary prevention strategy where you use universal messaging to entire populations, so you have no way of targeting messages to survivors, but maybe a place for us to think about that a little bit further. And also, again, to know that the experience of a survivor is going to look and feel and be different than a student who's not experienced these things. The next slide I won't talk through quite as much, but these are what we would perceive to be negative norms or chilling norms, the kinds of things that might prevent people from either confronting sexual misconduct when they saw it or reporting it if and when it happened to them. There were a series, again, 5 indicators. I don't know the language by heart, but the first one is like, you wouldn't report out of personal loyalty to the person who did it. You wouldn't report because you were afraid of retaliation. You wouldn't report because you were concerned someone else would get punished. You wouldn't report because you'd be perceived to be a troublemaker, and people who reported their educational or academic achievement would, or their career employment would suffer, again, depending on whether it was employee. Again, these questions were all asked about how, based on what you've heard, how likely is it that other students on your campus would not report because of all these chilling factors, and these were very low. So again, this is good. Any of these gray dots that represent percentage of folks that said moderately or very likely that were above the red line that determines when a belief becomes normative. No chilling factors. So again, good. You can predict that on the next slide, we're going to see some variation based on whether you've survived, whether you've experienced sexual misconduct. Again, we've got our employees kind of really having the highest regard for the campus norms, again, with the lowest bars here. Survivors, really close to that normative, and especially with people, most other students not reporting out of, based on their personal loyalties or friendships. That one's basically a normative thought in the minds of survivors. Again, a campus becomes, so if I was telling Carrie, is it worth putting your money in social norms marketing campaigns, I would say, well, across the board, your data, you don't have anything that's really seen as a chilling norm or as, the positive norms. We don't have to worry about that at the state level. level. However, some of you who have profile reports know that your campus may have looked a little different. There were every mean has some campuses that are above and some below. So again, these data are really useful in designing and deciding whether or not social norms on your campus need changed, and if so, how to do that. It is, again, I think the big pattern that we're seeing here is that survivors are experiencing norms, or perceiving norms differently than other populations, or other than students who've not been victimized. And we could guess that perhaps there'd be other populations where other subgroups would feel that way as well. I couldn't do those aggregate comparisons because every campus didn't ask about race or didn't ask about it the same way. The only standardized variable we had was gender. But, based on this, I would say, well, we're seeing differences based on survivor status. I'm willing to bet there's probably differences based on other things too. Okay, next slide. Implication here, again, just to go back to what I already said about the bystander empowerment, these positive social norms are another reason to say you've generally got optimistic students that believe that their peers are capable of positive behavior, and those are your messengers you want to work with. They already see the good and know the good in their fellow students, and so how can you continue to engage them in the prevention work that you're doing as messengers and collaborators? And I think now we move on to how do we really take what survivors have told us to adopt this survivor-centered approach. I looked at 2,430 survivors. There's no comparisons to any other group. This is what can these survivors in and of themselves tell us about their experiences. So we'll look at a few different things. First set of findings is basically prevalence rates are a little bit lower than what you might think based on national data, that victimization rates varied among the subgroups of students. And then this interesting finding to me on polyvictimization, that people who experience one type of sexual misconduct often have experienced other types as well. And we'll also look at sometimes it's on an ongoing pattern of repeated experiences. So this is an issue in the research world. People are really crazy about this finding because it's one of the strongest things that we see over and over and over again in the literature, that repeat victimization, that your biggest risk factor for being assaulted is previous victimization experience. So we've got concentrated problems. Okay, so let's look at the data that kind of illustrate this big thing. So again, these are just survivors. So the only reason you're even being included on this data set is because you've already said yes to one of the things. So to have a prevalence rate of 62% of people experiencing sexual harassment, that doesn't seem that high among a survivor group. So again, I think my general read of these numbers is, wow, they're a little bit lower than what I would have seen. I hear all the time that 1 in 5 women will be raped, full out sexual, rape by the time they get out of campus, and our sexual unwanted intercourse by force is at 17% just among survivors. So these numbers look a little bit low, and I think there's reason to say maybe we have a bit of an underestimate. Look at that 62%. We're going to kind of drill into that in the next slide. So remember that number for a couple reasons. So the first thing is that number is different based on your gender. So much more likely to report sexual harassment if you are female versus all other genders. I had to kind of combine all other genders into one group. So we've got female versus non. If we look at the next slide, really fascinating to me, the trend is reversed for stalking. So again, this is a statistically significant difference. Significantly more survivors of stalking had a gender identity other than female. Significantly fewer female survivors experienced stalking. The other three variables, there was no statistical difference. So in terms of unwanted sexual contact, unwanted sexual intercourse, and intimate partner violence, females and students of other genders are experiencing them at the same rate. So again, we need to be cognizant of this in the work that we do. We've known forever this is not a woman's problem, right? It's not a woman's problem to solve, but it's also not a woman's problem in terms of experiencing it. We see this problem affecting all genders. And in some cases, being female is a protective factor against stalking. So really, really important for the work as we move forward into, being more inclusive of multiple gender identities. Next slide. I want to break down for you what this poly-victimization is, because again, it's very powerful. We looked within this data. I counted up who had reported just one of those bars versus someone who had reported 2, 3, 4, or 5 of those bars. So this, the numbers, when those numbers mean, stand for the 5 types of victimizations we looked at: sexual harassment, unwanted stalking, unwanted sexual contact, unwanted sexual intercourse, and IPV. Those were the 5. So again, we know you've experienced one if you're in this data set. About a little over half of folks had only reported one of those experiences. The rest, so almost half, reported poly-victimization. And if you looked into that a little further, and we'll look at this on some slides, that poly-victimization was not randomly distributed. There were some patterns that could be found. I don't know who can remember when I drew that little circle around the first incident prevalence rate that we had, estimate that we had from the graph. And hopefully you're saying in your head, it was 63. It was 63. I can remember it was circled and it was 63. I hope that's right. Something around there, 62, 63. I didn't write it down. I think it was 63. It's an underestimate. And one of the ways that we can do better measurement is to use behaviorally specific measures of the incidents. So behaviorally specific measures are ones that don't just define something and say, did you experience this, yes or no? They give a specific behavior. And in the case of sexual harassment, I'm just highlighting the one that was most reported among those campuses who opted to include the behavioral measures. Someone made gestures, rude remarks, or used sexual body language to embarrass or upset you. This is sexual harassment, but we see 67% of our survivors saying they experienced this at least once, and 30% experiencing it 3 or more times. And this again compares to that, somebody type it in the chat box, was it 62 or 63% that we had our prevalence rate using definitional measures? So I think it's like a 5%. We're off by 5%. My point with all this is prevalence measures are very, very useful and a great place to start, especially if you just want to document the problem exists. We just need to continue showing our administrators that we need to work on this because it continues to be a problem on our campus, or to look at where is it more prevalent. If you start to get to the point where I hope many, many people are moving, where you believe that this can be prevented, you need a you need a more sensitive measure. And so we know that behaviorally specific measures of incidents do a better job of capturing a more nuanced picture of what's happening. It's helpful, just to know not everyone's going to self-identify, even when provided the definition of sexual harassment. And B, if you're doing prevention work, it's going to be really hard to change those big percentages, especially when it's asked since coming to this campus. Even if you prevented every new case from that person's sophomore year on, they're always going to be a yes. So I strongly encourage you, not everyone has the capacity, need, or reason to use this, but you know who you are. If you need a more sensitive measure because you want to document not just that you have a problem you need to solve, but the prevention practices that you're implementing on your campus are actually working, you need to be really seriously considering behaviorally specific measures of the incidents. So again, if you didn't use these measures, no big deal. Get your hands on this report or these slides at some point and think about it for future work. Next slide. Just again, a few implications here. If you've got low rates, you especially need that strong leadership to say, we're going to continue to prioritize this on your campus. Second implication talks a little bit about centering solutions. Where subgroups of people are disproportionately affected, we recommend figuring out what those most affected people's needs are and designing activities to better meet those needs. We often find that in so doing, you actually help the whole population. So a very, very well-known, quote-unquote, survivor-centered solution is trauma-informed care. If you train all your employees on what trauma looks like, how those reactions vary across people, how to recognize it, what to do, what kinds of things to say, what not to say, what kind of help people might need, you not only help your survivors of sexual misconduct on your campus, but you may also be able to help students that are experiencing all kinds of trauma, whether they come from violent communities, refugee I'm not going to list all the kinds of traumas that we as humans experience. I don't want to get into this because my time's running low and I've got to think through. If you can sort of advance, let me see where we are in this talk. Let's click ahead. Reporting rates are low. That's the finding. Students, let's pause here for a minute. Okay, so students are much more likely to tell an informal resource than anyone else, and that's not that surprising. I thought 10% who told no one. I initially thought, like, well, that's not that bad. You know, when I do social marketing, you're always told you're never going to get. There's always 10% that you're not going to get. So when I see 10%, I don't really worry. But 10 times more survivors chose to stay completely silent than called up a hotline or used a campus sexual assault advocate. When I thought about it that way, I think that's something to work on. Again, whether or not we need to push that 10% bar down, we definitely need to be pushing some of these other bars up. You know, people need to be not just turning to friends. If your friends are trained to tell you, hey, you know what, call this text chat line, even if you're not sure, you know, get some more resources, find out if there's ways that you can volunteer, whatever. I think I'm more concerned about pushing up some of those bars at the lower end of this graph than worrying so much about those 10 people that told no one. I'm apt to say they trusted their gut, and I'm not going to doubt them on that. It's some of the ones down on the bottom. I think we've got more work to do as a field. Okay, let's advance. Again, we see employees reporting at higher rates. If we look at the next slide, I'm hoping, this is more than I can. I don't know if people are able to stay. I don't know if I go over by 10 minutes. What do you think, Carrie?
Sharon, it's Carrie. I would say just go ahead because I can always send the recording to folks that have to jump off early.
Got it. Okay. I do think this is really important. So I'm glad to go over a little bit on time. I understand if you need to duck off. Thank you for being here. There are interesting findings that you can avail yourself of. And that is the more severe the type of sexual misconduct they experience, the more likely they were to report. So we see unwanted sexual intercourse, stalking, polyvictimization, and IPV. All of those are long-term patterns. They're all things that we have seen. You know, those are the kinds of assaults that sometimes end up in injury. I'll stop there. Those are the bad ones. They're all bad. I'm digging a hole. Anyways, those experiencing those kinds of things predict reporting. So we know we're doing a little bit better job for the things more traditionally thought of as assault or violence. Having received training, again, this is one of the bigger positive findings, is that if you were a survivor who had received training, more likely to report than those who didn't. I don't think I need more evidence to encourage you all to continue doing the training that you're doing. Class, this was interesting. 17% of underclass students reported versus 12% of upper class. Again, I take this as a positive sign that as a state and campuses have made this a priority and educated students more coming in, those younger cohorts who have been recipient of more messaging are reporting at higher rates than students that are upper class. So old dogs, new tricks, however you want to think about it. Underclass students are, and that was a trend. It wasn't statistically significant. We saw a trend of Greek students reporting more than non-Greek, which again, I think is positive because I know many, many campuses, again, this question would only have been asked if there were Greek students on campus and if the campus opted to include it. So that tells me that those were campuses probably where the prevention team had been working pretty carefully in those sub-communities. So again, it's working. The work that you're doing is having an effect. There were no significant differences on the other things that I looked at. Probably perhaps the most upsetting one there was the athletes, because I know we've done a lot of work with athletes. No significant difference at all. Again, though, this is tertiary prevention. How do you get those who've already been victimized to minimize the harm that's been done to them? A lot of the messaging that we're giving to our athletes is prevention, so it's not going to be captured with the kinds of variables we got. That's why we need to start thinking a little more sophisticated measurement as we get into more sophisticated kinds of prevention. And I know that athletes' messaging is much more likely to be prevention oriented. So maybe that's not as disturbing. Okay, next slide. What are some of the most significant barriers? I didn't actually think about this too much because there was a surprising amount of variability. You know, I prepared a profile report for all 50 campuses, and these varied really significantly based on your campus. So I would say it's probably most important to look at your own campus, what the patterns were there. A lot of this is predictable, but you could see, for example, there were some campuses where I feared I would be punished for violations like underage drinking, where that was really high. It doesn't look high here, but on some campuses. So again, this is a pattern of data that was really variable at the campus level. And so at the state level, while it's useful, I think this is something I'd refer most campuses to really study their profile report as opposed to the overall trends. Next slide talks about satisfaction. So if you remember, employees were much more likely to report to campuses, but interestingly, they were notably less satisfied with what happened when they went to those campuses. That's the big picture trend that you see here in the visualization. I would draw your eye to the N=4, that very small set of campuses asked that many drill down questions of their employees. So a lot of people kind of got some basic information from their employees. Only a few campuses asked about prevalence experiences and then opted to ask about did you report, and then opted to ask were you satisfied. So this is probably represents 2 different campuses, but in general, we've figured out how to work with our students a little bit better. And also the message of, going to reporting to your using the official reporting strategies is not always the thing that's going to make you happiest as an employee or as a student. So again, this to me is another piece of data that I would say turn back to those resources. Are there, local hotlines? Are there campus sexual advocates? Are there other ways that people, we need to get the reporting rate up, but until we get these processes working effectively, making sure that people know they have a variety of resources available to them. I'm a big fan of, in the initial stages while we're figuring some of this stuff out, putting into place systems for anonymous reporting where people can say, hey, this happened to me. I want to articulate it. I want it to be known. I want it counted. I want it named, but I don't want to move forward. I don't want anything done on behalf of me. I just want you to know this is happening, and allow us to kind of think about, hold that information and design solutions to it. So again, that's a recommendation. It's up to your own campus to decide how to handle things. But again, I'm a big fan of initiating anonymous reporting procedures in addition to all the other ranges of options that survivors have to them. Next slide. How do we get to that 4? Again, this isn't random. There's certain things that made the process more satisfying to others. Single victims, like folks who had only experienced one type of victimization, not our poly victims, were significantly more satisfied. Straight survivors were significantly more satisfied than students with other sexual orientations. And there were no relationships between satisfaction and gender identity, Greek participation, class cohort, or training. These would be things, again, when you were thinking about centering solutions. How do we center our processes to work for students who don't have a straight sexual orientation? How do we make sure our processes acknowledge the many times and many ways that people experience sexual victimization by the time they're willing to come forward? And those are the kinds of things that are, in this implication here. We know it's not perfect. The data just showed us that. How can we strengthen that? How can we get those satisfaction ratings up? How can we get those reporting rates up overall? And since this is a kind of heavy place to end, I thought about flipping it and starting with survivors at the beginning and ending with like training is working. But instead, if we advance to the next slide, I decided to take a little reflection from some of our Black women leaders and realize, the work that we're doing is not easy. It takes time. Don't agonize, organize. I love that one. So just some words of support to you all that continue to do this work. I've been inspired by what I see in the data that you've helped us to achieve. I've been honored and happy to work with so many of you, from from hearing about the work that you're doing to designing your survey to kind of poring over those profile reports to helping you with your action planning and data share backs. It's been great, and I'm hoping our paths cross in the future and that you keep on keeping on. And that will end the formal presentation. I did. Okay, so at the end, I included recommendations. I'm always kind of wary about this. These are all take with a grain of salt. I'm thinking for some of you, it's time to think about random sampling, behaviorally specific incidence measures. You're doing work that others need to see and know. Some more credible results are often you can share to people. If they're more credible, people are more likely to listen. So if you know you're doing something that's working, the more rigorous methods you adopt, the more people are going to listen to you.
Sharon, this is Ann Brandon. I've been here. I just wanted to say so much. Yay, I've been here. I've just been quiet. It's the first time I've been quiet. I know everybody probably wants to jump off, but I just want to remind everyone that we are here for a resource, even though the vendor service project is over. Please do not hesitate to reach out, as Sharon notated at the beginning of the webinar. We are here. So we're not just going to walk off and say, hey, a project over, we're done. Please let us know your needs. And Sharon and Carrie, thank you so much. This has been such a great experience, too.
Definitely, and a big thank you to both Sharon and Ann for all their work with the campuses, for your support and for your ongoing support. We truly appreciate you and value your partnership and your contributions to making our campuses successful here in Ohio. So thank you to both of you. And Sharon, thank you for doing this deeper dive for us today.
Yeah.
I did not see any questions come through. Presentation today, because you want to go back and review what Sharon said a little bit more, or if you would like to share it with others on your campus as you begin your planning for the future and whatnot, you just reach out to me and I will send you a copy of the webinar as soon as it is available. Sharon, Ann, any additional final thoughts?
That's it. I'm sure everybody wants to jump off, but yeah, we're here.
Yeah. I would say if you haven't eaten lunch, go eat your lunch and have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.